All right, this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 31, Section 2, Decolonization and Nation Building. So again, just a kind of quick review of where we are at in world history. This chapter, Chapter 31, is looking mostly at the post-World War II era. World War II ended in 1945. And in the post-World War II era, there are pretty much two major trends that are occurring around the globe. The first is the Cold War. We talked about that last section, 31-1. The second one is decolonization, and decolonization is the process by which states become independent. And we have a map here to kind of illustrate what's going on between 1945 and really the present day. Pretty much every single country around the world that had formerly been under imperial control became independent. So this map here is a breakdown of the various different nations. It has the dates under which they became independent, though it's listed pretty small here. And it shows you by color which nation they declared independence from. So recall that during the era of imperialism, which we covered in a previous chapter, roughly the year 1800 to typically 1914. That was when World War I broke out. But remember that during World War I, most nations did not become independent. It's only through the process of decolonization, a time period roughly we'll say 1945, the end of World War II, roughly up to 1991. It really just kind of depends. It's kind of an ongoing process today. But during the era of imperialism, the top industrial nations claimed about 85% of all global territory. Between the years 1945 and 1991, that 85% is becoming independent, right? And so you can see all of the various nations here. Some of the countries that we've already talked about previously include India, which is located right here, Pakistan, which is located in this area right here, and some others in between. So we'll be talking about the various countries and when they became independent, how they became independent, and that kind of shapes the modern world today. So first, South and Southeast Asia. South and Southeast Asia is referring specifically, or at least South Asia is India. Southeast Asia is Vietnam. Both of which we covered in previous sections. Vietnam we talked about in 31-1 in the Cold War, very heavily tied to the Cold War and competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. We talked previously about a chapter in India, and where we left off with India was essentially Gandhi's assassination. So following the assassination of Gandhi and following independence in 1947, India became independent. There were two states that were created, India and Pakistan. India was primarily a Hindu majority. Pakistan was primarily a Muslim majority. And so in that sense, a two-state solution was something that Gandhi really wanted to avoid. Gandhi wanted a one-state solution. That didn't happen. The British decided to go for this two-state solution. Following Gandhi's assassination, leadership of India passed to Nehru. Nehru was much more interested in things like industry, whereas Gandhi more or less promoted kind of traditional Indian culture. Gandhi was also much more of like a spiritual leader. Nehru was much more of a practical person in terms of leading India. But what continued between India and Pakistan, and we covered this in a previous section, was the territorial dispute in the Kashmir. So the Kashmir is a territory in dispute between India and Pakistan, and it's remained a sore spot between the two nations. In fact, both India and Pakistan have gone to war pretty much every 20 years or so over this particular territory, and tension between those two nations remain somewhat heightened today. Another important development that occurred in South Asia was the breaking away of Bangladesh. Bangladesh had previously been Pakistan. So we might say about Bangladesh broke away from Pakistan. And I believe that occurred in 1971. And, once you see a map, you can understand why. So the two-state solution, what the British tried to do essentially was to create two states in India, India and Pakistan, but Pakistan being where the majority Muslim population lived. This little territory right here, so that was Pakistan, and this was Pakistan, right? You could see how these are essentially the same country, but they're completely separated from one another. So this part right here broke away. That became the country of Bangladesh, right? So from the process of Great Britain leaving, we add on Myanmar, or Burma is what it was called before, but Myanmar today in 1947 broke away. Pretty much from British India, we have 4 countries that exist today: Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. Other places in Southeast Asia that gained their independence included Indonesia. Indonesia broke away from the Dutch. The leaders, or the nationalist leader, was Ahmed Sukarno, so we'll call him an Indonesian nationalist leader. All right, I want to say Indonesia gained their independence 1949, I want to say. Sukarno ruled or was the prime minister of Indonesia until 1967, when he was overthrown by a coup. A coup is a military overthrow. And in fact, some of these characteristics, like coups, government overthrows, conflicts, are going to be somewhat common in the process of decolonization. But by 1949, Indonesia became independent from the Dutch, Sukarno being its first prime minister. And then in 1967, a coup overthrew Sukarno. Indonesia was put primarily under a military dictatorship after that point. A couple of other countries that gained their independence: the Philippines in 1946 from the United States. The U.S. essentially had promised Philippine independence if it helped to fight against the Japanese, which it did. Myanmar, or also called Burma at the time, became independent from Great Britain in 1947, part of British India. In Africa, decolonization varied. Remember, Africa was a very large continent in which a lot of different European powers controlled. So if we take a look at Africa, we could see that essentially all of the green marks what the French had previously controlled. Kind of this yellowish color marked what the British controlled. There's some here with the Belgians in the orange. There's also, other countries like, the Portuguese, for example. So the process of decolonization varied in Africa, although we can make some broad generalizations. One is to say, and again, this is a broad generalization, is that for the most part, when it came to British colonies, this is true of India, this is true of the Middle East, this is true of Africa. For the most part, the British were willing to let go of those colonies, with one exception, and that was the exception that there was large settler populations. So anywhere where a lot of British people did not live, the British were more or less willing to part with their colonies. The French, on the other hand, were a little bit more, they wanted to, in some sense, hold on a little bit longer. Not in all cases, but generally speaking, the French were less willing to give up their colonies. A perfect example of this is Algeria, which, by the way, did, in some ways, this was similar to what the British did, because Algeria did have a large French settler population there. Algeria was an exception in that it was actually kind of like part of France as opposed to a French colony. It was more integrated. And if you look at a map, you can just see generally from the proximity as to why that is. Here is France right here, and here's Algeria. So there were a lot of French people that kind of lived on the coastline here, and this was very close to the French coastline right in that particular area. And so in Algeria, it was a very brutal and violent war for independence. The FLN, or Front de Liberation National, led we'll say a revolution might be a good way of putting it, against French rule. And after some years of bloodshed and warfare, eventually Algeria did break away and become independent. Although France remains still somewhat involved and integrated in Algeria, especially in the economy. Elsewhere, though, in most of Africa, decolonization was not violent, or at least, we'll say that in the rest of Africa, decolonization was more cooperative than revolution. Right? I think that's actually what your textbook states, right? There certainly was violence, so we'll say that. It was more of a cooperative effort than revolutionary. A lot of influence from World War II, especially ideas about sovereignty and self-determination, influenced nationalist movements on the African continent. Some examples of this include, or nationalist leaders include, Kwame Nkrumah. He is the nationalist leader of Ghana. Ghana became independent, I want to say, in the 1950s. Ghana's independence was probably, if you were to kind of rate it or put it on a scale, probably the most peaceful in terms of it becoming an independent nation. However, Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown in a coup in 1966, and there's been a number of successive coups in the country of Ghana since. Kenya was a little bit different of a story, because in Kenya there was a large British settler population. And again, in those areas, like we mentioned before, the British were a little bit less willing to let go of those particular colonies. Jomo Kenyatta was the Kenyan nationalist leader, so we'll call him Kenyan nationalists. Again, demanding independence. Typically, these individuals become the first prime minister of these nations once they do become independent. And because there was a larger settler population, the process of decolonization tended to be more violent. The Mau Mau revolt was violence between British and African populations, or at least British descent and African descent populations. But by the 1960s, Kenya also became an independent nation. The case of Congo probably illustrates us how decolonization was most closely tied to the Cold War. Congo was a Belgian colony. Belgium gave up that colony, but then Congo turned into essentially a civil war. And the various factions within Congo were fighting for power. They got support from the Cold War power. So in Belgium, there was Soviet and Western influence. Again, you can kind of think of the Cold War as this larger competition over ideology. And of course, both the Soviet Union and the Western nations like the United States had a vested influence or interest to make sure that the Belgian Congo either followed the Soviet model or didn't follow the Soviet model. Eventually, from the bloodshed, Mobutu Seko emerged as the dictator. At the time, it was called Zaire, later to be called the Congo. But he emerged as a dictator. He was more or less on the, he was an anti-communist, we'll say. Right, not allied with the Soviet Union, and he ruled that country as a dictator for like 40 years or something like that, a very, very long time. In South Africa, the process of decolonization was the most complicated. Recall that South Africa was a state that was created really with Dutch and British cooperation. It was tied to the British Commonwealth in the same way that like Canada and Australia was. It gained full independence in 1961. However, it was an apartheid state, and that was a state in which only whites, had, all the kind of political and economic control. In South Africa, the African population was about 75%, yet, Africans didn't have any economic control, didn't have any political power. The African National Congress, or the ANC, was created in order to try and increase the amount of political power. Protests, guerrilla wars, violence. This was a much longer movement. One example of violence was Sharpsville. This is where a number of members of the ANC were shot and killed. So Sharpsville, sometimes called a massacre. Let's say ANC members killed. The leader of the ANC, Nelson Mandela, was put in prison. And it took all the way really into the 1990s when Mandela was let go from prison. And voted first president. So, for South Africa to become, truly independent, it, really took all the way into the 1990s once the system of apartheid was, was overthrown. Decolonization in Latin America was a little bit different in a sense that Latin America had gained its independence 100 years earlier, but was still heavily influenced by, outside powers in the form of economics or economic imperialism. Economic imperialism is kind of like outside control of economic resources. So for example, in countries like Mexico, which we actually talked about in a previous chapter, outside powers would control, a majority of the land, would own most of the natural resources, would own the infrastructure, and that was very common in Latin America. A lot of nations responded to this, foreign control, or at least foreign ownership of industries, with economic nationalism. Economic nationalism is essentially to throw out foreign business and instead have domestic business. Mexico did this 1917. By the 1930s to the 1940s, Mexico had gained control over their oil again. Previously, it was mostly American businesses that controlled that. Other examples of trying to distance oneself from outside economic control include the case of Guatemala. In Guatemala, the United Fruit Company, this was a U.S. company, owned, most of the land and infrastructure in Guatemala. Infrastructure, RE. Sometimes Guatemala, because of this, was called a banana republic. And a banana republic is a country in which foreign businesses more or less control the government. This was named after the United Fruit Company, which grew, amongst other things, bananas in Guatemala. So, in Guatemala, even though it was technically an independent country, the land was owned by a foreign company. The infrastructure like railroads and stuff like that was owned. And the United Fruit Company even had influence on politicians. Guatemala attempted to go down the same route as Mexico by reclaiming a lot of their infrastructure and their government from outside forces. They were accused, the Guatemalan government was accused with working too close with the Soviet Union when the CIA helped to overthrow the Guatemalan government in fear of communism. And again, this is another good example of how decolonization plays against the backdrop of the Cold War. Guatemala attempting to reclaim its resources, essentially, and the United States seeing this as potentially a way for communism to spread in the Western Hemisphere, which was not acceptable at the time. And so the government of Guatemala was overthrown by the CIA. And, in the decades following that, there's been a lot of instability in that particular region. Cuba is also another great example of how decolonization and, the Cold War intersect. In 1959, Fidel Castro and Ernesto Che Guevara. Guevara, in many cases, became kind of like the poster boy for what decolonization meant in Latin America. And that was, again, ousting kind of foreign capitalist influence. In 1959, the pro-American regime was kicked out by Castro. Castro more or less asked for Soviet help. And this was especially the case after the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs was the failed CIA intervention. Oops, let me get a little messy here. Failed CIA intervention to oust Castro. Essentially, the United States tried to do what it did in Guatemala. The CIA was successful in Guatemala in overthrowing a government that it believed too friendly to the Soviet Union. Here, the CIA failed to get rid of Castro, and that led to the kind of pretext for the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Castro reached out to the Soviet Union for help, and the Soviet Union responded by placing missiles in Cuba. Again, a very tense situation. But one thing that the failed Bay of Pigs invasion also did was it really hurt the U.S. reputation in Latin America.